Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie Fairbanks, and I am a features programmer with Doc NYC. Today, I'm here with John Dower to talk about his newest film, The Mystery of D.B. Cooper. John formerly worked on My Scientology Movie, Thrilla in Manila, and Once in a Lifetime, The Extraordinary Story of New York Cosmos. Please welcome John. Hi, John. Thank you so much for sharing The Mystery of D.B. Cooper with Doc NYC and for joining us today.
Well, Doc NYC, thank you for having me.
So I have read that you were very interested in and borderline obsessed with the story of D.B. Cooper and why so many Americans were, identified with the mysterious airplane hijacker, why they felt there was this cult following around Cooper, and that you really wanted to make this film. So can you tell us a little bit about how you learned about the hijacking and how this project got started?
Well, actually, when I was first approached with this story, I'd not heard of it. I was kind of annoyed because I make quite a lot of documentaries in America. I love coming to America. I think you genuinely have an awesome country, and making films there is an absolute pleasure. I mean, you have issues, like the rest of us do, but I love making films there. And something like Thriller in Manila, I think, everyone said, well, why did it take an English guy to make this film? And it's like, well, because I guess Americans were too close to it, hadn't thought of it. So I like to pride myself on knowing all the big American stories. So I was quite annoyed when I first heard about Cooper. I didn't know this story. And I'm like, really? And can this really be true? It's kind of bonkers. It sounds literally made up. And so when we did a little bit of filming, God, we're talking like 4 years ago now, back in 2016. And I was a little bit, I'm not sure about that. And then as soon as we started filming, like, I became who I think everyone does. And I think we tried to reflect that in the film. You become obsessed. I mean, I still wake up in the middle of the night and think, maybe it is Dwayne Webber. So yeah, I like a lot of people became obsessed with it, and still am, even though I finished the film nearly a year ago.
I was going to ask you this question at the end, but since you just mentioned Dwayne, I'm sure that everyone in the audience is curious as to your personal thoughts about who is the real Dan Cooper.
Well, I think it does change. I mean, when we first did our first bit of filming, that was my experience. I'd sit in front of one of the suspects' group of friends, or ex-husband, ex-wife, or, stepdaughter or niece. And I think, hang on, it's this person. And then I'd go and sit in front of it, and I'm like, hang on, actually, it could be this person. And so I sort of wanted to reflect that feeling I had, that they all potentially, I mean, there's hundreds of Cooper suspects. And I think we allude to that in the film. Actually, people have seen the film by now if they're watching this, won't they? So there's that moment in the film where we talk about, Jeffrey Gray, who was a writer who went through this same obsession. That it's that story where, because it has these open elements, a lot of people in America used it, ex-wives used it to sort of point the finger at a husband's. But the key suspects, the top sort of 4 or 5, they all have elements in their story where you can go, it can be them. It's hard to be definitive, and I think that obviously that's why the FBI couldn't solve it in 50 years. I kind of want it to be Dwayne, because I think the Dwayne Webber story is just so out there, and it's got so many bits of detail that you literally couldn't script. And for me, in documentaries, those tend to be strangely the most authentic and telling stories. I still have an inkling it might be Richard Floyd McCoy, the copycat. And unfortunately, his wife, who just will not speak to anyone and hasn't spoken to anyone since the trial for his copycat hijacking, I think she's the key to that story and could potentially reveal it's him, but tantalizingly won't speak to anyone. So, but, I mean, who knows? It could even be Bob. But I think I sort of, in my heart, I want it to be Dwayne Webber, mainly because of Joe's experience of this story. It could be Floyd McCoy, but hey, it might not be any of them. I mean, that was a real fear making the film. It still is. I mean, we don't technically broadcast on HBO until the end of November and the BBC in the UK. What if somebody comes out and finds that bit of telling evidence that shows actually it's none of the people in your film? I mean, our film's over then. It's like it's irrelevant. So, but yeah, it's unlikely, I think.
Well, or then there's an update to the film, and then the film helped crack an unsolved case.
Yeah. The thought of going back into the edit on this one is I can't comprehend that.
You mentioned the FBI just now, and obviously getting all of the family members and the girlfriends and the step nieces and the ex-wives and everyone else of Richard and Dwayne and Bob and others was, I'm sure, quite a process. And I want to ask you about that. But I am curious, at what point did you get access to the FBI, and did they agree to be a part of the film?
The FBI were strangely quite approachable. I think because they're all retired now, the guys in this story. I think they were. It's a good question actually, because weirdly you think they'd be the hardest, and in fact, they were probably the easiest. We get in contact and they'd be like, "Yeah, sure. I'm around next Tuesday." The hardest, and I have to give a big shout out to my producer, Anna Stevens. The hardest people to get were the flight crew, because they've never really spoken about it in any real detail. I mean, Tina, the air stewardess, and Bill, the co-pilot, they did appear at the end of a sort of discovery type program with amateur sleuths, a year or two or so ago, but only on the condition that it was brief and they were just meeting up with each other. But they'd never done a proper interview. They took months and months. That was the most nerve-wracking bit, because I was very keen to have that narrative thread throughout the film. That's the real bit. That's the bit we can all agree on. That happened, or at least. But even Tina, the air stewardess, would say at times, "God, did that really happen?" I'm like, "Well, you sat next to the guy and you watched him jump out the back." So, but they were the hardest to get, and they were very resistant. And I think there's a moment in the film where you understand why, where they get quite emotional. And I think, the thing about this story is it has elements of a romp. It's a bit daft, and it was they say it's a victimless crime because he let the passengers off and he didn't ask for a lot of money and nobody got hurt. But imagine if you were a member of that flight crew flying at 10,000 feet with the back doors of a plane open, and a guy who claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase. Pretty traumatic. So I think they were resistant to talking and making it feel too cartoonish. But our pitch was, we're not making this. There are elements that are clearly cartoonish, but we're not turning this into a silly story. It has a serious edge to it. But they were a lot harder to get than the FBI.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Tina and the rest were more challenging to get, because the reenactment is the kind of narrative through line as we go and we explore who could DB Cooper be, but we keep coming back to the act of the crime and the moments of how it happened for the first part of the film. And so I'm just curious, this is something that so many people had read about and so many people had discussed. The crime was really well known. But at what point did you decide that you wanted to do a reenactment of those moments with?
Oh, yeah. I mean, don't get me started here. I mean, I should be careful what I say here. I kind of hate reenactments and documentaries, and I had this original idea because the problem is that everyone knows you're not on the actual plane, and I mean, weirdly, the thing with reenactments, the more money you spend on them, the less authentic they end up being. And I actually had this idea where I wanted to shoot it on a soundstage and say, look, we're not pretending to be on the actual plane, and we're not going to have dramatic, it's never as dramatic as the people telling you the actual story, but you still need to illustrate it in some way because you weren't there and you don't have pictures of it. So you have to do something. I had this idea of doing it all on a soundstage with rear projection, and to avoid the whole actors sitting in an actual plane. And then at the last minute, my financiers were like, it's too experimental, and so I had to do slightly traditional reenactment. But we did try and stylize it a bit, but there's no getting around. You have to sort of somehow illustrate what happened, because that is the chain of events. We can all agree on the plane landed, he got on, they brought the money on the parachute. And you still have to tell that bit of the story, because it is, I mean, it's a bloody good part of the story. I mean, whenever somebody asks you about DB Cooper and you start giving them the bare bones, okay, so they took off and there was a note and they were like, he asked for four, why did he ask for 4 parachutes? And, you know, so it has that sort of craziness to it. So we always had to tell that part of the story. So yeah, the reenactments are, you know, I apologize if some of you watching felt they were a little too cheesy, but hey, you know, we kind of get away with it, I think.
I think the reenactments work really well in the film, and thank you for sharing your thoughts about your artistic vision there. I think it just goes to show how much thought went into, you know, how do we build the tension and how do we relay the moments that led up to this monumental cold case.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that with us. As you started to sit down and interview all of the individuals who claim to have known the, you know, the real DB Cooper, whether it was Richard or Dwayne or Bob or some of the others, what was it that surprised you the most about their different recollections or their really various DB Coopers?
I think the thing that, and I think this is what the most important thing. That was a good question, because I think actually the most important thing in this film for me was representing all their stories in an honorable way. So it would have been very easy to present them all as a bunch of wackos or cranks. As I was saying, one of the reasons why I love documentaries, you suddenly have these moments that are completely unexpected, unscripted. And we turned up to interview Joe for the first time in Florida. And suddenly there's this young guy there who starts interrupting while we're filming, and to make sure the story's told properly. And it turns out that he's what she calls her memory man. And he's there to sort of preserve her version of the story, because she's getting older and she can't remember it. He watched the film and he said, I'd like to thank you, because it would have been very easy to present me in a sort of, you know, satirical way, or do what we English call, you know, take the piss out of me. And we didn't. And that was the key thing for me in telling all these people's stories, is that we sort of honored their belief. You know, these people believe these stories, they live them. This isn't like some sort of crazy hobby. They genuinely believe that. And, you know, at the risk of not sounding like too much of a pretentious twat, you know, it sort of rolled over into the area of sort of grief and loneliness. You know, I think Joe's still grieving for her husband. One of the reasons she needs to keep this story alive is because she had the shock of discovering he was someone else. She still misses him. She wants to figure out who he is. What did it mean for their relationship? So that was the key thing when we interviewed all of them, was to respect and represent their stories in a, you know, never look down on them. You know, that, you know, these stories all, you know, had carried their own weight in that respect, even though viewers might find some of the elements quite fantastical.
I mean, yes, some of their stories can be, you know, incredulous, but at the same time, I think the fact that you treat them with respect, that authenticity comes through, and it's a testament to you as a director that, you know, they're all very interesting individuals, but this is their truth. And it's their truth surrounding a story that so many people feel ownership over. Whereas for them, as you say, it was their world. So thank you so much for giving the, you know, sharing the spotlight and allowing so many people to talk about their experience with Dan Cooper, and for making this incredible film. Unfortunately, this is all that we have time for, but thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Everyone at home, please put your hands together for the director of The Mystery of DB Cooper, John Dower. Thank you so much for being here and for telling us a little bit more about your process.
Pleasure. Good luck, everyone, at the beginning of November. I think you need it.